Half of the world's seaborne trade passes through the South China Sea, valued at $5.3 trillion annually. The South China Sea dispute has the potential to rule against the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, the constitution for the oceans and seas of our planet. For the Philippines, what is at stake is 80% of its exclusive economic zone, EEZ, and 100% of its extended continental shelf, ECS, in the South China Sea. Either the Philippines keeps them or loses them to China. The root cause of the South China Sea dispute is China's 9-dashed lines claim, which gobbles up large areas of the EEZs of the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia. China has indisputable sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea and the adjacent waters, and enjoys sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters as well as the seabed and subsoil thereof. The terms adjacent and relevant waters are not UNCLOS terms. China refuses to explain the meaning of adjacent or relevant waters. Do these terms mean that China claims all the waters and resources enclosed by the 9-dashed lines? We shall examine China's acts, regulations, declarations, and practices in the South China Sea to understand how China interprets and applies the terms adjacent and relevant waters. In 1988, China seized Subi Reef from the Philippines by erecting a radar structure and military facilities on the reef. Subi Reef is a low-tide elevation, LTE, outside of the Philippines' EEZ, but within its extended continental shelf. Subi Reef is just outside the 12 nautical miles territorial sea of the Philippine-occupied Pagasa, Thitu Island. Under United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, only the Philippines can erect structures or create an artificial island on Subi Reef. The waters of Subi Reef are part of the high seas of the South China Sea. In 1995, China seized Mischief Reef from the Philippines. Mischief Reef, located 125 nautical miles from Palawan, is a low-tide elevation within the Philippines' EEZ. As in low-tide elevation beyond the territorial sea of any state, it is part of the submerged continental shelf of the adjacent coastal state, which is the Philippines. Under United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, only the Philippines can exploit its natural resources or erect structures on it. In 2011, the Philippines invited bids for the exploration of Area 3 and Area 4 in the Reed Bank, well within the Philippines' EEZ. On 4 July 2011, China protested and sent a note verbale to the Philippines, stating, "The Chinese government urges the Philippine side to immediately withdraw the bidding offer in Areas 3 and 4, refrain from any action that infringes on China's sovereignty and sovereign rights." Since 2011, Chinese Coast Guard vessels have prevented Philippine-commissioned ships from undertaking oil and gas surveys in the Reed Bank, which is entirely within the Philippines' EEZ. The 9-dashed lines cut through Mampaya, the Philippines' largest operating gas field, which supplies 40% of the energy requirement of Luzon. Mampaya will run out of gas in 10 to 12 years. In 2012, China invited an international bidding for the exploration of areas within the EEZ of Vietnam. China published this map, naming it Location for Part of Open Blocks in Waters under Jurisdiction of the People's Republic of China, available for foreign cooperation in the year of 2012. In 2013, China released a new map of China, adding a 10th dash on the eastern side of Taiwan. In its 2013 map, China claims the 10-dashed lines are its national boundaries, without again explaining the legal basis or giving the fixed coordinates for the dashes. The 2013 China map was published by Cinemaps Press, under the jurisdiction of China's State Bureau of Surveying and Mapping. This means the 2013 map is an official Chinese government map. In its note verbale of June 7, 2013 to China, the Philippines stated it strongly objects to the indication that the 9 dashed lines are China's national boundaries in the West Philippine Sea/South China Sea. The Philippines will be left with a sliver of water as its territorial sea and EEZ. The Philippines and China will have a very long common sea border from Balabac Island in southern Palawan to Yaman Island in northern Batanes. The dashed lines are just 64 kilometers from Balabac Island, 70 kilometers from the coast of Burgos, Ilocos Norte, and 44 kilometers from Yaman Island. Since at least 2012, China has been periodically laying sovereignty steel markers on the seabed of James Shoal. China claims James Shoal as its southernmost border. James Shoal is fully submerged at 22 meters below the water surface and is situated more than 950 nautical miles from Hainan Island and more than 400 nautical miles from Itu Aba. Under UNCLOS, the maximum maritime zone that a state can claim is 350 nautical miles from baselines along its coast. Under international law, a state's border must either be a land territory, a river, or a territorial sea, which are all subject to its full sovereignty. A state cannot appropriate as its sovereign territory a fully submerged area beyond its territorial sea. James Shoal is 80 kilometers from Malaysia's coast in Bintulu, Sarawak, within Malaysia's EEZ. A Chinese task force composed of 3 warships from the South China Sea Fleet of the Navy of the Chinese People's Liberation Army held a sovereignty oath-swearing ceremony on January 26, 2014 in the waters of James Shoal off the coast of Sarawak, Borneo in the South China Sea. The Singapore Straits Times quoted China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Qin Gang that Malaysia did not lodge any protest against China. In 2012, China seized Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines. In November 2012, following a 3-month standoff between Philippine and Chinese vessels around the shoal, China informed the Philippines that Chinese Coast Guard vessels would remain permanently on the shoal. Scarborough Shoal, including its lagoon, has an area of 58 square miles or 150 square kilometers, 15,000 hectares. Located 124 nautical miles from Zambales, Scarborough Shoal is rich in fisheries and is one of the traditional fishing grounds of Filipino fishermen. The shoal is a high tide elevation, with the biggest rock protruding 1.2 meter above water at high tide. China claims that Scarborough Shoal generates at 200 nautical miles EEZ. In 2013, China seized Lukonis Shoals from Malaysia. Malaysian National Security Minister Shahidan Qasim posted on Facebook on June 4, 2015, the location map of Lukonis Shoals, 54 nautical miles from Sarawak, with this statement: "This small island is not a disputed territory, but the foreign ship which came here has intruded into our national waters." That foreign ship is the Chinese Coast Guard vessel Haijing 1123, which anchored on Lukonis Shoals since April 2013 and has remained there up to now. Lukonis Shoals, covering 100 square miles, are one of the largest reef formations in the South China Sea. Lukonis Shoals, with a sandbar of water at high tide, are rich in fish, oil, and gas. China claims that all geologic features in the Spratlys generate at 200 nautical miles EEZ. In 2014, China's Hainan province issued fisheries regulations prohibiting foreign fishing vessels from fishing in the waters administered by Hainan unless they secure permits from Chinese authorities. Hainan's fisheries regulations cover 2 million square kilometers out of the 3.5 million square kilometers total area of the South China Sea. In 2014, China placed its $1 billion HD 981 oil rig within the EEZ of Vietnam. In protest, Vietnamese workers in export processing zones in Vietnam rioted, burning several Chinese factories. A Vietnamese fishing boat sank near the oil rig after being rammed by a Chinese vessel. All these acts of China, among so many others, demonstrate beyond doubt that China is claiming sovereign rights and jurisdiction to all the waters, fisheries, seabed and subsoil enclosed by the 9 dashed lines. The Philippines loses about 80% of its EEZ facing the West Philippine Sea, including the entire reed bank and part of the Malampaya gas field. Malaysia loses also about 80% of its EEZ in Sabah and Sarawak facing the South China Sea, as well as most of its active gas and oil fields in the same area. Vietnam loses about 50% of its total EEZ. Brunei loses about 90% of its total EEZ. Indonesia loses about 30% of its EEZ, facing the South China Sea in the Tuna Islands, whose surrounding waters comprise the largest gas field in Southeast Asia. China is mass-producing destroyers, frigates, corvettes, and other warships at a faster rate than any other country in world history during peacetime. According to the US Office of Naval Intelligence, during 2014 alone, more than 60 naval ships and crafts were laid down, launched, or commissioned, with a similar number expected through the end of 2015. China launched its 25th Type 056 corvette in March 19, 2015, out of a total planned 40 Type 056 corvette fleet. The PLA Navy believes that it can control the South China Sea with 20 of these corvettes. China will deploy this year a 10,000-ton Coast Guard vessel, the world's largest blue water Coast Guard vessel. A second 10,000-ton sister ship is under construction. China has more Coast Guard vessels than Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines combined. China's Coast Guard is the largest blue water Coast Guard fleet in the world. Under its 2015 China military strategy, China will shift from offshore waters defense to the combined offshore waters defense and open seas protection. The CMS states, "The traditional mentality that land outweighs the sea must be abandoned, and great importance has to be attached to managing the seas and oceans and protecting maritime rights and interests." An island above water at high tide is entitled to a 12 nautical miles territorial sea. If such island is capable of human habitation or economic life of its own, it is entitled to a 200 nautical miles EEZ. If such island has a natural prolongation of its continental shelf within its EEZ, it is entitled to an ECS up to an additional 150 nautical miles from the outer limits of its EEZ. The maximum maritime zone a non-archipelagic coastal state can claim is 350 nautical miles from its coastline. China, a non-archipelagic state, is claiming maritime zones more than 350 nautical miles from its coastline. The Philippine arbitration case against China is not a territorial dispute, but solely a maritime dispute involving the interpretation or application of UNCLOS. Whether the waters enclosed by China's 9 dashed lines can encroach on the 200 nautical miles exclusive economic zone of the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea. This is the fundamental issue raised by the Philippines before the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea Tribunal. The Philippines is not asking the tribunal to rule what state owns certain islands or rocks above water at high tide. The Philippines is asking the tribunal to rule what is the extent of the maritime entitlements 200 nautical miles of certain islands or rocks, regardless of what state owns them, and whether certain geologic features are LTEs or not. All these are maritime disputes. There is no need to settle first who has sovereignty over these geologic features to determine their maritime entitlements. China claims that since the basic principle is the land dominates the sea, sovereignty over the land must first be determined before maritime entitlements can be allocated. However, the 9 dashed lines are not based or measured from land, so this principle cannot not apply. What applies is the reverse of the principle. The absence of land dominates, no sea. Since the 9 dashed lines are not measured from land, and even completely ignore land as source of the lines, they cannot claim any sea. The dispute whether the 9 dashed lines or historic rights can be the basis to claim maritime zones is a dispute involving the interpretation of UNCLOS, not a dispute involving boundary delimitation between states. China has ongoing reclamations on 7 reefs: Fiery Cross Reef, Quateron Reef, Gavin Reef, Johnson South Reef, McKinnon Reef, Mischief Reef, and Subi Reef. These are all the reefs China occupies. However, China has actually also dredged 10 other reefs for filling materials for the 7 reefs China is reclaiming. China has explained, the primary purpose of these activities is to improve the working and living conditions of personnel stationed there, to better fulfill our international obligations concerning maritime search and rescue, disaster prevention and mitigation, and to enable China to provide better services to vessels from China, her neighbors, and other countries sailing in the South China Sea. One of the reclamation projects of China is an airbase with a seaport, expected to be completed in 2015. The airbase, with a 3,000-meter runway, is on a 270-hectare reclamation on Fiery Cross Reef, larger than 213-hectare Woody Island, China's airbase and largest in the Paracels. This reclamation will also be larger than the combined area of the 20 largest islands in the Spratlys, and more than twice the area of Diego Garcia Island, the U.S. airbase in the Indian Ocean. Before World War II, China's southernmost defense perimeter was Hainan Island. Before the war, China did not have a single soldier or sailor stationed in any SCS island outside of Hainan Island. Right after the war, China took over the Amphitrite group of the Paracels and Etuaba in the Spratlys following the defeat of the Japanese, moving China's defense perimeter southward. In 1974, China forcibly dislodged the South Vietnamese from the Crescent Group of the Paracels. In 1988, China forcibly evicted Vietnam from Johnson South Reef, moving China's southernmost defense perimeter to the Spratlys. In 1995, China seized Mischief Reef from the Philippines, just 125 nm from Palawan. In 2012, China seized Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines, just 124 nm from Luzon. In 2013, China seized Wukona Shoals from Malaysia, just 54 nm from Sarawak's coast. In 2014, China started reclaiming rocks and submerged areas in the Spratlys to build air and naval bases. Thank you for watching, like and subscribe for more.